All right. We sort of have, let's kind of put together pieces that we've discussed over the last couple of weeks. We've talked about design. We've talked about what makes good design. And first of all, we said good design is meant to showcase the content on the page that people are interested in order to fulfill their needs. All right, maybe we didn't use those exact words, but we talked about goals and we talked about people achieving their goals, and that's really the purpose of a website. And the design of the page ought to make that easy. All right, the design of the site ought to make that easy. And you did a lab assignment about web design and some good and bad principles of web design, and you're going to carry that forward into all future assignments that you're going to do. We then took a step back and talked about CSS, and we talked about how everything on the page is a box. All right, at least all of the block tags. Remember, there's two kinds of tags: blocks, block and inline. Blocks stack on top of each other are things like nav, header, section, and so on. Inline tags are tags that sit side by side. For example, an image tag is an inline tag. If you have two image tags, they won't be on top of each other, they'll be next to each other. So we talked about the block model. Really, what comes next then is arranging those blocks on the screen. All right, arranging those blocks on the screen in a way that makes it clear to the user exactly what your content is and allows them to identify at a glance different sections of the page and what different things mean. All right. For example, we could look up a website in another language. Let's look up Finnish newspapers. I don't want them in English. This is in English, unfortunately. Probably giving me English because it knows that more than likely I am an English speaker. So let's see, is there an advanced search that I can go to? All right, let's look at this. Non-English. Maybe, well, whatever. For Polish. All right, finally success. Okay, question. And you know, you don't have to answer out loud, but you can just think of the answer. Can you tell what the navigation of this page is? I would guess that this is a navigation. Along with this, so there's sort of a one level of navigation up here, another level over here. Along this side, I would guess would be ads. This is a news article. This is a different news article. This is a different news article, and there's different news articles going down there. We can glean a lot of information about the design of the site without even knowing the language, assuming you don't know Japanese. All right. Why can we do that? Because of the way the page is designed and the way the visual design and the visual aspects of the page highlight and focus the user on different content on the page. Now, one thing that is important to recognize, a famous web designer said this years ago, is that people spend more time on the internet on sites other than your own. So there's certain conventions that people use when designing sites, and it's best to sort of follow those conventions. That makes it easier for the user. If we visited another site, let's visit a US site, Amazon. The navigation's similarly located and has the same general visual appearance. My point of all this is, and I hope the point gets across, despite the fact that it took me a little while to get to it, is that the way you make your page looks goes far in logically organizing the material so that your user can easily find stuff on your page. So we're going to always keep that in mind as we're designing our pages. So what I have here is I have prototype for a website. So one thing that you have to do for your design, your project design, is to create a prototype. And remember, I said a prototype is like a model. It doesn't have to be complete, but it should give the user an idea of what the website is going to look like. Because you're going to use that to communicate to people. You're going to use it to communicate to people on your design team. You're going to use it to communicate to the people you're developing the website for, and give them an idea of what the website is going to look like. So I've created 6 different prototypes, and that's not uncommon to create several different prototypes and show it to a customer. If, for example, a bakery came to me and said, Mike, we want you to design a website for us. What I might do is I might mock up 2 or 3 different options for the CSS of how their site's going to look. As long as I'm not developing the whole site, as long as I'm sort of just mocking up a prototype, that wouldn't take terribly long. And then they could look at it and they could decide, well, I like this design, I like that design, I like this design, but maybe change these colors and so on. So I developed a bunch of prototypes here, and it's all of the same content. So if we look at these, this is a content, the content on this page is for a travel agency. All right. So this is the first prototype I've developed. I've used Greek text because, again, this is a prototype. It doesn't need to be finished. All right. Doesn't need to be finished work. So I'm allowed to use Greek text on the prototype. So let's look at how I developed this. The first thing I did is I developed a template and the CSS file. Let's look at the template. And let's look at the CSS file. I'm going to follow this sort of procedure, and this is the procedure I suggest you do in creating your website. Develop first a template. And what I mean by a template is a page that you can use to base all your other pages off of. I'm not going to develop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pages from scratch. I'm going to develop a model, a template for one of the pages, and then I'm going to clone that template for each of the specific pages. So in other words, to do 8 pages doesn't take 8 times as long as to do 1 page, because you come up with your template first and you put everything in that template that's going to be common on all the pages. What's going to be common on most pages? Well, there's going to be a banner at the top of the page. That's going to be the header. There's going to be a navigation. There's going to be some content, and there's going to be a footer. I've decided from my wireframes, remember the wireframes that we drew? I decided from the wireframes that these are the common sections of each page. So I'm going to put that in the template so that when I duplicate the template, I don't have to go in and change every single part of the page. I just change the part of the page that's different in each place. So what did I put in the template? I put in a link to the style sheet. I actually put in a link to a Google font. Link to the style sheet, have my header, have my navigation, have a section, a main section, and then finally I have a footer. So when I want to make another page, let's say I want to make a page for Brazil. I don't make a page from scratch. I take this template, I copy it, I rename it, and then I go in and edit it. And the only part I'm going to change is this section here. And I'm not going to put the full text in here, but I would probably create an H1 that says Brazil. And some paragraph about Brazil. Now, of course, I'm going to do more than that if this is my real project. All right. But the point is, I don't have to worry about coding the footer or the nav or the header or the body or the style sheet or anything like that, because I've already done that. So all I have to do is copy and change this one section of the page. And if I do that, then I have a page about Brazil for my site. So if you look at this, the HTML of this is basically what we've been doing all along. HTML, header with a title, a link to a style sheet. Ignore this for now. Body tag with a header, with a nav, a section, and with a footer. You've been doing this since virtually lab 1 or 2. All right, so the HTML, there's nothing really new or different or exciting about. What we're talking about now is arranging the pieces on the page. So let's look at the style sheet that we have for this, and let's take it one bit at a time. First thing I have is I have on the body tag a background dash image. And that URL is called backgroundtile.png. Now again, notice that the file backgroundtile.png is in the same folder as the web sheet and the style sheet. So all I have to do is put in the file name, backgroundtile.png. If we look at this file, we bring it up in Paint or something. File is only one small square. But think of this like tile that you might have on a floor or on a wall. The way the tile is made is these little lines connect when they're placed side by side and stacked vertically. So it's just one little tile, but when they're all arranged together, they form a pattern. There's a lot of places where you can go out and find these kinds of patterns. I found it on this particular site, webassistant.com. There we go. It's a little page that allows you to generate a pattern. You can pick your color, you can pick your texture, and it'll generate a tile for you. You can download it. Again, if you're going to do that, give credit to the site. So the first thing I have is I have a background image. Since I didn't say anything about repeating, it's going to repeat all the way across the page and all the way down for however long the page is. So like in this case, page is long, it'll repeat for the whole length. For this page, the page is short, and it will repeat for the whole length. So that's the background image. The fonts, I specify 3 of them. I specify Helvetica, Arial, and sans serif. I select 3 of them because some machines, some clients, some users visiting the site may not have one or more of those fonts. So what this is doing is this is giving the browser an option to pick the font that the user has. So when I load this page, what it's going to look for first is going to look for Helvetica. If the browser has that font, it will use that. If the browser doesn't have it, it will use Arial. Now, typically all Macs have Helvetica and all Windows machines have Arial. So that's going to cover just about all of the machines out there. If there happens to be a stray machine here or there that doesn't have either of these fonts, we're just going to use a generic sans serif font. Okay, we'll talk about what sans serif means in a minute here. But browsers, each browser has a generic serif font and a generic sans serif font. So this is simply a list that each browser goes through and looks. Does it have this one? If so, use it. If not, go to this one. And then the last one is guaranteed that the browser will have one of these, a generic sans serif font. Now, what do I mean by serif and sans serif? There's little things on letters that are called serifs. So if I pick a font of, say, Times New Roman, which is sort of the default font for many browsers, and I type the letter T, notice how there's this little line at the bottom of the T, like right over here, and there's these little, I don't know what you call them, wings on the end of the T. Those little things are called serifs. All right? Things are called serifs. So a serif font's going to have those little things. Another example of a serif font would be this one. All right, has those little things. The font looks totally different, but it's classified as a serif font because it has those little things. Should be able to tell at a glance whether a font is serif or the opposite, which is sans serif. There's another example of a serif font. Now, sans serif fonts simply mean without those serifs. So Arial is an example. Notice there's no little thingy coming down on the end of the T or going across on the vertical line of the T. It's sans. Sans is French for without. So sans serif means without that serif. Now, which are best to use on a website? Generally speaking, and you can vary this up a little bit, these are just general rules. We want to use serif fonts for headlines and sans serif fonts for text. That's sort of a good rule of thumb to go by. Now, is it a crime if you don't follow that rule? No. But that's sort of a good guideline. We look at, say, the Wall Street Journal website. I think they follow. Notice their headings are serif fonts, headline serif fonts. The text of the article is sans serif. On a computer, sans serif fonts are easier to read on smaller font. That's why when you notice in my example, I use a sans serif font. Whoops. For the body of the article. Now, sans serif and serif are the two main classes of fonts. All right. A third class of fonts are called either script or decorative fonts. They would be ones that look like this, where it's meant to look like handwriting or it's decorative in some way or another. That's a T, believe it or not. As a general rule, I would avoid these decorative fonts except in very, very, very rare circumstances. Remember, you're going to want your fonts to sort of match the content of your website. All right. But you want to make your fonts readable as well. Readable is sort of the first priority with fonts. The more professional or serious a website is, perhaps you'd lean towards serif fonts. Sans serif fonts are often used for things that want to be perceived as being modern and streamlined. For example, if you go to Apple website, notice that they have a very specific font that they use. In fact, if you look on their products, all their products sort of use the same font to sort of give themselves brand identification with that. But the whole idea, these sans serif fonts sort of are clean, are modern, are streamlined. Whereas something like the Wall Street Journal, something that is more traditional, uses a mix of serif and sans serif fonts. My suggestion is to play around with it, make sure it's readable, make sure it looks good to you, and make sure that it doesn't conflict with the message that you're trying to give. All right. But anyhow, that's how you define fonts in CSS. You give a list of them because the browser will go down, and Visual Studio Code gives us a nice summary of what this does. Goes down and determines which font a particular machine has and uses that one. All right, let's look at the header. I've given it a width of 600 pixels. All right, so what that means is this is 600 pixels going across. What's a pixel? A pixel is an individual dot on the computer screen. If you were to like get a magnifying glass and look really close on the screen, it's not a continuous image. The image is made of a bunch of dots that are spaced very close together so that when they look from, from the distance that humans normally look at them, it looks like one continuous picture. But these are really a bunch of just a bunch of little dots. Well, we made this 600 of those dots across. That's the space of the whole content area from here, the inside of the border, to the inside of the border. Actually, from the inside of the padding to the inside of the padding. All right. We specified a padding of 15 pixels. What does that mean? It means that there's 15 pixels between this text and the border. We specified the background color is white. Text align center, that puts this headline in the center. If you don't say anything, the default is left. The border is solid, black, and 2 pixels wide. Remember, we can get away with saying just one property border and give it 3 values because the browser is smart enough to know that 2 pixels is a width and that black is a color and solid is a type. So it actually figures that out based on the different properties you give it. Last thing that we didn't look at last time is a border radius of 55 pixels. That's how curved this is. The higher number, the more curved it is. So if I made this 5 pixels and saved it, it's a little hard to see, but this isn't a square corner. This is a very slightly rounded corner. And if I were to make that, say, 15 pixels, it's a little more rounded. I made it 500 pixels. I hate to think what it's going to look like. It's going to be essentially a circle. Yeah, it looks like a circle. Doesn't even look, this doesn't even look like the side of a rectangle. But I wanted it to be sort of a rounded rectangle, so I make it 50, and that's somewhere in the middle. So you can see this is the line here, but it's rounded. Now, one of my suggestions to you is to go and download these examples of the prototype and try playing around with them. What happens if I do certain things? What happens, for example, if I get rid of this background white? All right. Well, if I get rid of the background white, then the body's background takes over. The whole idea of cascading style sheets is the values cascade down. So if I declare a property on the body, if I don't override it for the header, then the header gets the same property as the body does. If I do override it, then what I declare on the header takes precedence. I got rid of the padding. Notice there's less space between the text and the border. I got rid of the text align. We text align left. Now, one of the key things in this is a margin of 0 pixels and auto. What that means is that there's no space vertically between this and its neighbor. So you notice that the navigation, which is its neighbor, is right on top of, not right on top, but directly next to the header. The auto simply means to center it between the left and right. So remember, when we have just two properties, it's top, right, then we repeat bottom and left. So there's 0 on the top and bottom, auto on the right and left, and that centers it. Now, because we made this 600 pixels, this width is always going to be the same. We've hard coded that number in. So if I make the window bigger or smaller, it's still 600 pixels, still the same width. But the margin adjusts to always keep it in the center. Another thing we can do is instead of saying 600 pixels, we could say something like 600 or 60%. And then when the window's wider, that header gets bigger. When the window gets smaller, it gets smaller. So when we give sizes, we can either give an absolute number of pixels or we can give a percentage. Now, looking forward a little bit, when we start talking about developing websites that work for phones, we're going to use percentages an awful lot because different people have different size phones. All right. And if you have a phone that has a smaller screen versus someone that has a gigantic phone, you still want the page to look right. You don't want it to be like all crammed into one corner on a big phone or too wide on a little phone. All right. You're going to use percentages. So you might make it go across 100%. So however wide it is, the size will accommodate. All right. That's all I had for the header part of it. Again, play around with these, change the values and see what happens. All right, next thing I have is I have a style for the H1. And for that, I set the font family as being Garamond or serif. I only have 2 fonts here. So if a machine has Garamond installed, it will use Garamond. If a machine does not have Garamond installed, it will use the generic serif font for that browser. I've also centered the, that's the H1. So that's why you notice that the fonts on this page are all that Helvetica, Arial, sans serif, except for the H1s. All the H1s on the page have a different style. So this H1, this H1, and so on. We're looking at the index here, so I probably should open that one up. This H1. All right. Navigation. We want this to match up pretty much with the other one. All right, let's save the changes. Refresh it. We want the width to be the same. We want the margins to be the same, so it goes together with that. So I've really just copied on the header the width, the margin, the padding, and so on. The background, the border radius, and all that. So the header and nav both have the same style. One shortcut you could do is you could do header comma nav, and then it will apply for both the header and the nav. Regardless of that, I usually don't do that. That way, if I decide to make something about the nav different than the header, I can change one without worrying about changing the other. All right, let's look at the nav a little more closely. First of all, I have nav UL, list style type none. What does that mean? Nav UL is a different kind of selector. Notice here we have H1. That means every H1 on the page. Nav UL simply means the ULs in the nav section. So if I have an unordered list elsewhere on the page, I'm not using this style rule. So nav UL means just the ULs in the navigation section. And I've said list style type none. All right, what does that mean? That means this is going to change what this does rather is this gets rid of the bullet point. Notice how normally in an unordered list, we have bullet points in front of it. Here, this is another UL, but we don't have that little period in front of it. We don't have the dot in front of it. All right, nav LI means every LI within the navigation section. And I say display inline. So what that does is that puts the LIs next to each other. This navigation is simply a UL and an LI that's styled to not have the bullet points and to go horizontal. If I got rid of this in the CSS, the navigation would look like any other unordered list, more or less. Now, here's the last thing I do. And this is the one thing that I probably commented on a lot of people's assignments. We didn't talk about styling links before, so a lot of people had good color schemes, but the links were very hard to read because maybe they had blue links against, a purplish kind of background color. So purple background color is fine, except the links didn't show up really well against it. You sort of had to strain to see the links. Links get styled differently. So if I give something a color, I give the body of the page a color, that doesn't affect the links. I have to style the links separately. So I'm making the color of this link blue, and the background I'm making actually a shade of gray. That's what $CCCCC means. Again, the red, green, and blue are all equal, so that's a shade of gray. So if you notice then, if we look at this, the background of each of the links is a shade of gray. I have a border around it. I have a very small radius, so they're slightly rounded. Might not even be able to tell that at a glance. Some padding. Text decoration none means that these links aren't underlined. By default, you get blue links that are underlined if you don't have anything in your CSS about links. I can get rid of that underline because you don't really need it here. It's pretty obvious, just like on the Japanese page that we viewed, that these are the links. These are the navigations. So I showed that these are links other ways. So I got rid of the underline. Put some padding on it, got rid of that, color blue, background that color. Now, this is what's called a pseudo class. Again, this rule only applies to links within the navigation section. Now I say links in the navigation section, if I hover on them, that is, if I put my mouse on them, I can actually change the style. And I change it to make the background of it blue and the color of the text white. So that sort of gives this a little button look. Back in the old days, people did terrible things in design, like they made images for their buttons. And they have to make a separate image for each button because they had to put the text in the image. This is a much better way to do it because you can actually go and you can put the CSS to make these look like little buttons. And when you put the mouse over it, you can change any of these rules. I could make the font bigger when I moused over it. So I could say font size 1M. I'll talk about what M's are in a second. Actually makes the font bigger, makes it jump out a little bit. An M is how much is emphasized. 1 means it's an average size. It's a normal default size. 0.8 means it's slightly smaller than normal. So the link, when the mouse is not over it, is 0.8 M. So it's a little bit smaller than normal, but when I put my mouse on it, it becomes normal size. Couple more things. Section. Pretty much copied from the other two, except I have a font family of Poppins sans serif. If you remember back, we downloaded this font from Google Fonts. We downloaded the Poppins font. And if you Google how to use Google Font, it will show you few of full instructions on how to do that. Shows you a couple ways to do it actually. I use this way. If you're not interested in that, you can just ignore that part of it. Since I'm pretty sure that most people don't have this font, I put in this style code on my webpage to download it. Put this link in here. All right, this is something different. So far, all our CSS has been based on tag names, right? The body tag, the header tag, the H1 tag, the nav tag, the UL tag inside the nav tag, the LI tag inside the nav tag, the A tag inside the nav tag, the section tag. This is not important. And what that means is anything that has a class of important. I can identify different things on my page as having different classes. And those classes describe why that paragraph or why that section or why anything, that link, is different than the other ones. So this paragraph is different in my example because I've determined this to be extra important. So I give it a class of important. So I could show something is important a couple different ways, right? I could make it red. I could make it bigger. Well, in this case, I made it red and I made it bold. So this stands out. And it stands out even if you're colorblind, because if you can't see the red, you can at least see that it's bold. Footer, kind of have the same thing. Credits. Notice instead of a dot, I have a pound sign. What that means is if something on the page has an ID of credits, then it gets the style rule. So a dot means class, an ID means is shown with a pound sign. What's the difference between class and ID? A class can be shared between many different things on the page, whereas an ID should only refer to one thing on the page. All right, there's only one thing on the web page that has a ID of credits. I could make several different paragraphs important, though, by giving them a different class. This is a lot to unpack, all right? It's a lot of different style rules. My suggestion is that you take it, play with it, do something that looks good for you, do something that's individual for you, all right? You have resources at W3C School. You have resources, these examples that I give. The next example for next prototype in this series of prototypes takes the same HTML, but uses percentages. And you can imagine on a browser, it looks like this. On a phone, it might look like this. Here's a totally different layout for this page. Now, here's the thing. This page, the HTML of this page is identical to this page. Identical HTML, but they look totally different because I've arranged those boxes differently. All right. That's the goal of this section, for you to be able to take the same basic HTML and make it look as differently as possible. So next week, what we'll do is we'll cover some of these other prototypes and show you how you can arrange the boxes in different ways to give a different look. In this example, you know, we had the links going across the page. If there were a bunch of links, maybe we decide to have them going down the bottom, going down the side of the page would be a better layout. So maybe we would present it this way instead. All right, that's all I had for today. If there are no questions, we'll see you in lab, or we will see you next week.